"You're fired, Emma," he said without even looking up. 1 month later, she stood in that same parking lot, coffee in hand, silence in her head. And now, no one got fired without her signature. Daniel Hansen was the kind of man you called when a server crashed on Christmas Eve or the new hire couldn't print their first invoice. 56, wiry, graying at the temples, with a half-buttoned flannel and that weary but kind "I got it" look. He had been with Silver Point Systems longer than most of the executives had been out of college, 28 years in the trenches. No awards, no headlines. Just uptime, stability, quiet excellence. That Tuesday evening, Daniel stayed late. Again, not because he had to, because someone needed him. Jason Moore, the new guy from the BI team, had been struggling all day to get a batch job scheduled through the legacy interface. The poor kid looked like he hadn't slept. Daniel noticed, quietly walked over. He didn't gloat, didn't talk down. He just leaned in and said, "Try setting the access flag to recursive, not absolute. That backend hates global paths." 5 minutes later, it worked. Jason looked like he'd seen a miracle. "You saved me," Jason said with a grin. Daniel just gave a half smile and muttered, "Glad it worked. Get some rest." The next morning, Daniel was called into conference room C. He had a bad feeling even before he walked through the door. 3 chairs, one occupied by Paula from HR, the other by Derek Sandoval, Senior Director of Operations, the kind of man who talked like a TED speaker and blinked too much when he was nervous. "Daniel," Paula began with that rehearsed sympathy HR people practice in front of mirrors, "we want to thank you for your service." His jaw twitched. "You're letting me go." Derek cleared his throat. "We're undergoing a restructuring phase, operational realignment. Your skill set, while deeply valued, doesn't align with the emerging architecture we're implementing." Bullshit. Pure, polished corporate bullshit. Daniel didn't flinch. "I see." He didn't mention that he'd built the entire asset tagging system in 03 from scratch when the company was still renting a single floor downtown. He didn't remind them that he wrote the backup recovery protocol they still used, or that during the ransomware scare of 2017, he stayed 73 hours straight, restoring clean images while everyone else panicked and refreshed Reddit. Instead, he stood. Paula smiled, a little too brightly. "We're offering a transition package, 3 weeks severance, plus access to resume coaching services." Derek slid the folder toward him like he was passing a bill across the bar. No eye contact. Daniel didn't take the folder. "Just one thing," he said, voice calm, sharp as a knife that had just been pulled from the drawer. "Why?" Derek exhaled. "It was brought to our attention that you accessed secured modules outside of your team scope, namely last night's BI scheduler. That falls under analytics, not engineering." Daniel blinked. Once, slowly. "So I was fired for helping a colleague," Paula interjected. "For violating access protocol. Intent is not the issue. Policy is." He almost laughed. Almost. No ceremony followed, no farewell lunch, no team card, just an escort by a 25-year-old security guard named Brian, who looked like he was about to apologize but thought better of it. Daniel drove home in silence. That night, he stood in the garage looking at the workbench he built with his son back in '99, the same one that held his original backup drive from the NT 4 days. His hands, still dirty from decades of server racks, curled into fists. They had no idea what they'd just thrown away. They thought they'd fired a technician. They'd actually just lit a match under the wrong man. Emma sat in her car in the far corner of the lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. For the first time in years, she was actually shaking. Not from fear, not from sadness, but from pure, blistering rage. She had held this company together with duct tape, deadlines, and a discipline no executive could fake. And this was the thanks she got? She stared through the windshield at the mirrored glass of the building she'd once called home. The place where she'd saved Josh's job in 2022 after he fumbled a critical deal with a logistics client, the one she'd personally coached him through while on vacation. She'd written the backup marketing strategy from a cabin in Colorado, one bar of cell service at a time. She'd been back in the office 7 days after burying her mother. 7. And Josh? He was nowhere to be found. Now, she was the villain in a story she'd built from chapter 1. The next morning, Silver Point buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. The Emma situation was the unspoken headline in every hallway. Her name didn't come up in meetings. No one acknowledged her desk sat empty, and God forbid someone mentioned the word unfair. Noah, the poor kid she helped, tried to defend himself, tried to explain that she hadn't overstepped, just helped, but Derek shut him down in front of the whole floor. "We don't reward dependency," he snapped, as if the company hadn't depended on Emma for the past decade. Noah was slapped with a formal reprimand, then reassigned to project hygiene, which in real terms meant digital janitor duty, a job that stripped him of any future mobility. He didn't deserve that, but fairness hadn't been part of Silver Point's playbook for a long time. Emma? She became radioactive, like a ghost no one dared acknowledge. You could practically see people pretending not to glance at her empty chair. She didn't just lose her job, she was erased. She returned to the parking lot that afternoon, parked in the same spot, and stared at that building like it was a crime scene. It was Jim, one of the oldest techs on the floor, who finally said what no one else would. He passed her car on the way to his rusted Chevy, glanced sideways, and muttered through the cracked window. "Can't be better than the boss in this place. That's not ambition, that's a threat." Then he nodded once. Respect. Resignation. Both. Emma didn't reply. She just looked forward. That building? She knew every inch of it. Every contract behind those walls. Every vendor handshake. Every shortcut buried under years of mergers and marketing gloss. She'd helped build the damn infrastructure, literally signed off on the blueprint for the data ops floor. Her fingerprints were on policies still being quoted like gospel at Monday stand-ups. And all of it? Every late night, every deck she polished for someone else's promotion, every crisis she snuffed out before it made the quarterly review. It meant nothing when stacked against corporate cowardice and a fragile male ego in a pressed shirt. They didn't just fire her. They made the fatal error of thinking she'd stay quiet. And Emma? She had just stopped shaking. Emma didn't drive home. She didn't need a hot bath, a glass of wine, or anyone telling her, maybe it's for the best. She needed facts, leverage, paper trails. So she drove to her real office, not the one with the glass desk and corporate art on the 12th floor, her real office, tucked inside a nondescript gray building with no nameplate off a quiet street in the outskirts of town. She punched in the code, stepped inside, and closed the door behind her. This wasn't her side project. This was Sable Tech, because the company that just let her go for breaking a rule she didn't break, yay, that company legally belonged to her, 82% of it to be exact. Sable Tech had always been hers, established through a holding structure in Delaware, papered and protected by the best corporate attorneys money could buy. She'd spent years in the background, building the bones while letting someone else wear the tie on stage. Josh, the public face, the shiny operational lead who dazzled investors with buzzwords she'd written for him the night before. He thought he was the CEO. Emma knew better. On paper, he was an employee. On payroll, on borrowed confidence. She flipped open her laptop and logged into the system. No hesitation, no second guessing. And there it was. She wasn't looking for revenge, she was looking for breach. In under 20 minutes, Emma uncovered 2 high-level transactions from the last 12 months, both approved without her direct signature, both executed using her delegated authorization rights, originally meant for emergencies. But these weren't emergencies. They were power plays. One of the deals skirted the line of a serious compliance violation, an acquisition Josh pushed through with a third-party vendor in Singapore without proper due diligence. If it blew up, regulators wouldn't call him. They'd call her, because the legal trail still stopped at her trust. Her breath stayed steady. No panic, just precision. By 10:40 p.m., she was on a secure call with Lawrence Pierce, her personal attorney of 17 years. The man who helped her draft the ownership structure from day one. The man who once said, if they ever forget who built it, remind them, on letterhead. At midnight, his office lights were still on. They were already drafting formal documentation, internal violation notices, asset protection triggers, and emergency leadership review filings under Delaware corporate law. Quietly, thoroughly, legally. Josh had moved 2 pieces off the board. Emma just reached for the queen. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. It was about protecting what she built, about setting fire to the polite lie they'd all told themselves, that she was just a founding partner, not the owner, just part of the team, not the architect, not the backbone. They thought she'd stay down. They forgot who taught them how to rise. Emma didn't plan to return to the office. She planned to take it back, one signed document at a time. And this time, she wouldn't be quiet about it. Friday morning, Boardroom A. The room where deals were made, bonuses were whispered, and decisions, good, bad, and spineless, were carved into company history. Josh sat at the head of the long walnut table, perfectly groomed and radiating confidence like he was hosting a victory parade in his own honor. Cuffed sleeves, custom pen in hand, that smug posture that says, "I already won." The board members, 8 of them, give or take a few on video call, chatted lightly about quarterly earnings and the usual jargon no one ever really questioned, until the door opened, and in walked Emma. Not the Emma they thought they knew, not the smiling fixer, not the behind-the-scenes team player. No, this Emma wore a tailored slate gray suit, sharp enough to slice the tension in half. Hair up, eyes forward, folder in hand like it was a sealed verdict. Josh's jaw twitched, as if the air had shifted. What is she doing here? He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Emma didn't flinch. She walked to the front of the room, his spot, and placed her folder down with deliberate precision. "Everyone, please remain seated," she said, calm but cutting. "Shareholders are entitled to attend board proceedings, and as a reminder," she looked straight at Josh. I hold the majority stake." Silence. Then a ripple, whispers, side glances, confusion. The kind of uncomfortable shuffle that happens when the room realizes the ground just moved. Josh stood, arms out. "You can't just walk in here and—" "I can," she cut in, her tone like steel. "And I am. Effective immediately, I'm removing you from your position as Chief Operating Officer." He laughed, a dry, forced sound. "That's not how this works." She opened the folder, sliding copies across the table with practiced clarity. "Here are the documents, the protocol, the signatures, and the audit findings you conveniently never expected to surface." The room froze. One of the remote directors leaned in toward the camera. "Emma, are these internal compliance documents?" "They are," she nodded, "verified by outside counsel, 2 unauthorized transactions, 1 borderline criminal, and both trace back to this man's misuse of executive authority." Josh's face flushed red. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "I'm following the law," she said evenly. You broke it." He pushed back his chair to stand. The room barely registered the movement because security had already stepped through the back door. 2 guards. Calm. Waiting. Emma didn't even turn around. "The board will be informed," she continued, her voice steady. "The State Attorney General's office will receive our audit results within the hour. And Josh—" She paused just long enough to let the silence grow teeth. "Start preparing, because your next meeting won't be in this building. It'll be in court." Josh looked around the room for an ally. A glance here, a silent plea there. No one met his eyes. He adjusted his blazer, tried to collect whatever dignity was still sitting on the floor, and marched out, past the guards, past Emma, past the company he thought he controlled. Emma stood alone at the head of the table, and no one questioned who was in charge now. By the end of the week, Sabletech didn't just have a new leader, it had a new soul. The headlines didn't catch it. The press didn't cover it. But inside the walls of that building, where fear had once hung like recycled air, something radical was happening. Emma Hansen wasn't just back in charge, she was rewriting the manual. The first domino fell on Monday morning. A company-wide announcement hit inboxes at 8 a.m. sharp. Effective immediately, Sabletech will undergo a complete leadership restructure. All executive decisions will now be governed by merit, transparency, and verified contribution, not politics, not appearances. That was the subject line. The message? That came in person. Emma stepped into the main floor conference room, the one with the glass walls everyone used to avoid eye contact with, and stood in front of the entire core team. Developers, analysts, admins, old-timers, and interns. Every seat was filled. She didn't hold a clicker, no charts, no presentation, just her words. "I want to start with this," she said, voice calm but charged. "I made a mistake. I let a polished structure hide the rot beneath it. I let politics decide who got heard. That ends today." You could hear the silence, so heavy it felt physical. She turned to Noah, sitting in the second row, his posture tight, shoulders uncertain. "Noah," she said clearly, "I owe you an apology. You did nothing wrong, and I should have protected you sooner." He blinked, swallowed hard, then nodded. "You're back on your project. Effective now." And then she looked at the room. Not through them, not over them, at them. "From here forward," she said, "Sable Tech is going to mean something again. No more games. No more titles with no teeth. Just results, effort, and respect. That's the new deal." By Tuesday, an anonymous reporting line went live, connected directly to Emma's newly appointed internal ethics lead, not HR, not filtered through 3 layers of silence. Direct. By Wednesday, 3 senior managers were quietly relieved of duty, not because Emma had a grudge, but because the audit made it clear they'd turned a blind eye to retaliation, backdoor deal-making, and the kind of management style that used silence as a weapon. They were shown the door, with documentation in hand, no dramatics, no performative outrage, just accountability. She brought in independent HR auditors from outside the company. No more reviewing ourselves. She wanted fresh eyes, clean processes, a system that protected people, not just profit margins. By Thursday, something wild started to happen. People started smiling again. There was laughter in the break room. Not nervous, not forced. The kind of real, shoulder-loosening sound that hadn't been heard in months. Jokes, collaboration, coworkers actually helping each other without watching their backs. In a week, the fear in that building cracked, and through it came something that looked a whole lot like purpose. 1 month later. Emma stood in the exact same parking spot where everything had changed. Same cracked asphalt, same oil stains from overworked commuter cars, same chipped curb where she'd once leaned back in the driver's seat and tried to breathe through the weight of humiliation. But this time, her hands weren't clenched around a steering wheel. They were wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, steam rising in the morning chill. No tremors, no uncertainty, just stillness, clarity, and freedom. Not from the company, not from Sable Tech. Freedom from fear. It wasn't just the job they had tried to take from her. It was her voice, her presence, her right to lead the business she had built. They wanted her invisible, useful, but out of the frame, strategic, but silent, capable, but compliant. And for years, she played along, letting Josh take the credit, letting others wear the title while she carried the weight. But not anymore. Emma looked up at the mirrored windows of the building, tall, polished, trying so hard to look invincible. A month ago, she'd stood in that same spot, feeling like everything she'd poured into Sable Tech had just been ripped out from under her. Now, she stood with her head high. This company didn't define her. She defined it. Inside those walls, everything had changed. She had changed it, not through tantrums, not through revenge, through action, structure, decisive choices made in the quiet hours when no one was watching. Emma had always been underestimated, and that was their mistake. Letting her go had opened the door to something unstoppable. She turned her gaze toward the front entrance where 2 young interns were walking in laughing, actually laughing, not whispering nervously like people used to. She caught the eye of a senior developer who offered her a small nod, the kind that said, "I see what you did. Thank you." The energy inside Sable Tech had shifted. You could feel it before even crossing the threshold. People weren't looking over their shoulders anymore. They were leaning into their work, sharing ideas, standing taller because someone finally told them they were allowed to. Emma had become more than a founder or an executive. She was a symbol now. Proof that integrity didn't need to be quiet. That leadership didn't mean hiding behind a polished resume and a recycled mission statement. It meant owning your power and using it to lift others up, not tear them down. She sipped her coffee slowly. Her mind wasn't racing. Her pulse wasn't climbing. For once, she wasn't strategizing 10 moves ahead. She didn't have to. The work was already in motion. The systems had been rebuilt. The toxic layer of leadership was gone. The company had been cracked open, and light was finally getting in. She thought of Noah, of the look on his face, when she reinstated him publicly and apologized without qualifiers. of Jim, the old tech from the basement, who now ran systems training and smiled for the first time in years. Of the new voices being promoted based on merit, not relationships, Sabletech wasn't perfect, but it was finally honest. And if anyone ever tried to drag it back into the shadows, they'd have to get past her first. The so-called big bosses who once sat in back rooms talking about market value and executive optics, they were irrelevant now, because no board vote, no performance review, no strategy deck could compete with the truth that lived in that parking lot a month ago. Emma Hansen had already won, not because she survived, because she refused to stay erased. She took one last breath of morning air, straightened her shoulders, and headed for the doors. She didn't need to announce her presence. The building already knew who was walking in. She stepped across the threshold, not as a visitor, not as a returning employee, but as the one who had been behind it all along. This wasn't a comeback, it was a homecoming. And this time, her name was on every wall, whether they could see it or not.